welcome to this forum on housing. We're looking at, in particular, at student housing and the fight for better rights for renters, better rights for students, young people, a better housing system generally, and stronger and more public housing, which is the backbone of a really kind of strong system overall. So we'll go through the event agenda in a second, but it's important to acknowledge that we're holding this meeting on stolen, unceded Aboriginal land. I'm personally calling in from Gadigal land in Redfern, where I haven't left this 5 kilometres of Gadigal land in a long time. Keen to go up and explore Darug and Gundagara country in a couple of days to go and see my family. We've got people calling in from all other areas as well, and from Queensland. Welcome, Iswed. So it's important to recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. And when we're talking about housing, this is all housing obviously built on stolen land. It's built on lands dispossessed from the thousands of years strong connection to country that Aboriginal people have. Aboriginal communities were moved around the country into missions, isolated from existing communities, from connections to country. Housing has been a persistent issue since colonialism began, and it continues to be an issue, with Aboriginal people being significantly more likely to need housing support, to access government support for housing, which shouldn't necessarily be a bad thing, but in this awful capitalist hellscape that we live in, that's what it is. So it's important that we keep that in mind when we're talking about housing, in particular when we're fighting for better public housing. That Aboriginal housing is a really, really key part of that. If everyone just feel free to change your name to your preferred name and pronouns if you like, and we will mostly be hearing from myself and the speakers over the session, but we will have a bit of time for questions, clarifications throughout, and a bit of discussion at the end, hopefully. So get thinking about any questions you're interested in around housing, and yeah, feel free to pipe up if you do have a question through the session. So in order to kind of understand the housing system and how we actually fight for stronger and better housing for young people, for students, it's important to get an overview of the housing system generally. So I'll give a brief kind of run through of the system, and then we'll hear from our speakers. I'm sure everyone here knows Leah, who is our current welfare officer at UCID. Leah's studying political economy. She's been involved in past and present education campaigns through the EAG. Leah's also been particularly active in housing campaigns around Glebe, so working with Hands Off Glebe and the community there to defend public housing, and supporting the CFMEU's green ban on Willow Grove and historic heritage building there. And she's also been involved in Palestinian solidarity work, climate justice, and anti-poverty activism. So very glad to have Leah joining us on the forum. We also have Aman Kapoor, who is an international student studying from India, studying architecture at UCID. When the pandemic started last year and there was no support announced by the government for international students' housing in particular, Aman organised other international students at the Sydney University Village and fought for a rent reduction, rent suspension, of student housing rents, and won thousands of dollars in rent reductions and for international students living in the Sydney University Village. So really excellent to hear, excited to hear from Aman as well about his experience. We also have Iswed joining us all the way from Queensland. Welcome. Iswed is a member of the anarchist communists Mianjin organisation, and has experience organising across a range of issues. Recently, they have been active in setting up the Southeast Queensland Union of Renters, so grassroots tenants unions, or SECURE for short, however you want to pronounce that Q in there. It's a grassroots tenants union that emphasises member participation and collective action as the methods for growing, developing the tenants movement. So a really unique example of strong direct action from below for in Australia around housing rights. So yeah, pleasure to have everyone here with us. So before we get into the general discussion, I thought it would be good to go over the basics of the system. So has anyone had much experience or knowledge, around the New South Wales housing system? If you have ever interacted with a local council or a planning application or some sort of, trying to access housing in some way, had to go through the rental tribunal, it's pretty complex. So it can be very difficult to understand exactly what's going on. So I'll just share my screen. And so when thinking about, can everyone see that? Good. So yeah, when thinking about housing, there's kind of there's a couple of different ways to understand it. So obviously we know that there's rental accommodation, which people don't own, but you access housing, essentially on a week by week basis or a month by month basis, and you have a landlord who owns that housing. But that there's a range of different ownership and rental. I guess you call them tenure types across that spectrum. And it goes all the way from people who are, obviously homeless, who don't have access to housing, to people who outright own their own home or own multiple homes and become housing providers. So this is in quotation marks intentionally. So the provision of housing is fraught in the Australian system. It's obviously for profit most of the time. Very, very rarely do you get public beneficiary, public housing provided as a public good. There is quite limited numbers of social and public housing dwellings in Australia across all the different states. So you get a mix of different services, organizations, institutions, and individuals owning and distributing or facilitating access to different kinds of housing, whether that's public housing, affordable housing, Aboriginal housing, homelessness services, crisis accommodation, or just rental accommodation itself. So we won't go into the nitty gritty of it, but I just thought I'd give a bit of an overview about like those different kinds of affordable housing that or social housing that I just mentioned, because this is kind of what's often referred to as the solution when we talk about housing crises. People who spend more than 30% of their income in rent are considered to be in rental stress. And that's a symptom of housing unaffordability. And so this product, affordable housing, does exist, but it's actually not necessarily affordable to people who need it. And it's not necessarily affordable to the people who even live in it, based on that definition of housing stress, which I just mentioned. So affordable housing sits in this gap between social housing, which is public housing, and diverse housing types, which is, this model is a bit not ideal, but essentially this is rental housing or privately owned housing. So affordable housing is generally provided by like a community housing provider. So that's an organization that is regulated by the government and can only set rents at a certain rate. That is not very low, this rate. It's generally about 75% of the market rate in a certain area. So that tends to cater to people who have fairly, moderately paying jobs, like a reasonable full-time job, registered nurses, full-time retail workers, level 3, some tradespeople, even all the way up to ambulance officers, community service employees, and school teachers just with a bit of experience who work full-time sit just outside of this band of accessibility for affordable housing. So it's actually not really, when we think about affordable housing, we've got to separate that out from what is actually affordable as housing. And it's also separate from social housing, which is where public and you know, actually sort of like rent controlled to a significant degree, and eligibility controlled housing exists. Those is sort of termed as social housing. Is this all kind of making sense? This is a very kind of complicated graph, I guess. But yeah, essentially there's a number of different types provided by different groups, whether it's the government or corporations or NGOs that are regulated by the government. Social housing is set at 30% of an individual's income, and you can only be eligible for social housing if you earn below a certain rate, so below that threshold, which I just mentioned in the graph. And so looking at the demand for social housing and what's actually available for people, this is also where it gets pretty dire. So this is where we're talking about the crisis. This is just generally, so it's not referring specifically to young people or students, but obviously they're significantly impacted or disproportionately represented in these statistics. So these heat maps or graphs and the numbers as well show exactly how much social housing need there is across New South Wales and in this other graph, Greater Sydney. So there's around 135,000 people said to be in need of social housing in New South Wales, whether that means they're in severe housing stress, so really cannot afford to pay their rent or their mortgage, or on the verge of homelessness, essentially, is the definition for requiring being in need of social housing, and 69,700 people in Greater Sydney. So that's a lot of people, and the waiting list itself, which is slightly separate from this this housing need, the sort of general housing need. So that's people who are actually on the waiting list for social housing in New South Wales. The general waiting list is 46,000 people. So that's a lot of people who urgently require housing that's affordable. So there's a lot of people who have waited up to 10 years. And if you get on the list now and apply for social housing, it could be a 10-year wait, depending on what area you're in, to actually get into housing. So that's people with families living in their cars and things like that, who just cannot access public, social, affordable housing because it is not available. We don't have enough dwellings. And when we get to sort of the student side of things as well, I think it's interesting to look at what's marketed as student housing. So similar to affordable housing, we get sold this image of apartments and units and dwellings that are meant to be for students, but in reality they're inaccessible to the vast majority of individuals who would study, work part-time, work a casual job, perhaps in hospitality or retail. I know I personally, when I was, in my first and second years of uni, couldn't afford $409 a week for a tiny studio apartment in a massive apartment block. So there's a range of different kind of options, but essentially most of these options are really small micro apartments, often where you share a kitchen with someone else, with 6 other people, and people will be paying upwards of $300 a week for these units, and so there's a huge amount of these being built, of course, because they're very profitable for the corporations that own them and rent them out to people, but there's not a lot of social housing being built, and this is definitely not affordable housing. So I guess just to finish off, and we'll hear from our speakers, I think this is all part of a general decline in public housing, and not only the sort of provision of it, but the perception of it as well, by both governments and the general population. So when in the sort of post-war, or I guess pre-war era, the Second World War, public housing was built quite significantly to house migrant communities, working families, people returning from war, especially, and it was used as an economic booster in the rebuilding of Australia, I guess. So it was provided as a public good rather than a welfare necessity. Not to say that model is perfect, but it did provide a lot more public housing than we currently have. Obviously, with the neoliberalization, which I'm sure people are aware of as a concept, this has slowly become a lot more market-driven. The provision of housing is, essentially said to be determined by what the market provides. So, if there's houses being built in a certain area, that's because people need it, which is actually, of course, not true. Houses are being built where it's profitable, and so public housing has been pushed and subjugated into a really, really strictly defined criteria. It's really for the poorest of the poor and the most crisis situations, and people with the highest, most complex needs, which of course snowballs and exacerbates the public stigma around public housing generally, which makes governments less inclined to build more of it. So yeah, we're in a bit of a sticky situation, I guess, in terms of housing in New South Wales and Australia generally. There's very little political support for building more, for providing more. There's not very much public support either. So that's where we come in, I guess. This is what we are talking about now, is how do we actually respond to this? Like, what does that mean for people who need housing, for young people in particular? And, what are the kinds of ways that we can access and create better systems and actually just, organize and push for better housing? So yeah, I hope that was clear. It's a very complex system and there's a lot going on, but if you have any questions on it, maybe we can come back to it at the end and circle around to the system itself. But I just wanted to, I guess, to hear from our speakers. I think it would be good to start off by, just getting a sense of like what your experience with the housing system has been. Each of you has a particular interest and has been active in different campaigns around housing. So, of course, you must have had some sort of experience, good or bad, about what the housing system where you are. So yeah, what's been your experience, Aman?
Okay, so in this forum, I would like to share my experience as an international student. So as an international student, when we are moving to a new country, there's a fear and a little bit of anxiety because you have no clue how your experience might be as soon as you land in a new country, where you don't know anyone, you don't have any friends, and your family is not there to support you. So in order to address those concerns, many international students go for university managed student accommodation because they are close to university, so you don't have to worry about getting lost in the buses or train in a new country. And B, since they are managed by university, you always have a sense of security that if something is going wrong, you can just complain to university. That is the only people you know in a new country, and they will help you. So just by considering these points in mind, I moved to Sydney. When I moved to Sydney in 2017, I also went to student accommodation. I went to the Sydney University Village, which is located just 7-minute walk away from university. At that time, when I started living in the SUV, Sydney University Village, rent was $310 per week, and I was sharing the flat with 4 other people. Luckily, the flat in which I moved in was not bad, and the people I met there were lovely. So in general, the living experience was decent, but now comes the bad part, which is the sky-high rent and accommodation management, who treat international students as a mint. So as long as you are giving them your money, you're good. But as soon as you are facing financial difficulties, you are nothing to them, and you would be kicked out from your room within seconds. Now, I would like to share my experience of living in student housing during the pandemic. So before pandemic, I was somehow managing to pay the rent, mostly with the help of my parents. But when the increase in COVID cases and lockdown, everything stopped. My dad's office in India was closed. They couldn't help me with anything, and I didn't have any money with me as well. And I started getting eviction notice from the SUV management. It was very stressful, and I couldn't focus on my studies as well. My mental health had a great impact because of this situation, and due to which I suffered in my studies too. And this is the reason why I'm still at uni when I was supposed to finish last year. So yeah, education begins at home, and because of lack of affordable housing, students suffer both mentally and education-wise.
Thank you, Man. That's you have a really powerful story, I think, but it's indicative of so much that's frustrating and wrong with the housing system as it is, and especially for students. guess would it be interested to hear what your experience has been, and especially, you know, given that it's a slightly different context to New South Wales as well.
Yeah, just quickly as well, on the pronouncing of the name, the acronym, it's secure. We thought that was very clever when we came up with it. So yeah, that it's secure if anyone ever wants to know.
That makes a lot more sense than secure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Before starting, I'd like to quickly acknowledge that I'm speaking on the land of the Turrbal people tonight, and that sovereignty was never ceded. So yeah, like, you know, one thing we can say for Queensland is we've had the worst renters' rights in Australia for a long, long time. But we did, at least like compared to Sydney, have significantly lower rents for quite a while. For anyone that's been keeping up with how that stuff's been going, that's no longer the case, I believe. Our rents have skyrocketed over the last 10 months in Brisbane, and up by like 25% in the Gold Coast and Sunshine Coast and stuff. So overall, it's pretty similar situations. You know, public housing has a similar wait list, like, you know, when you compare the populations. I think I have family members that have been on it for, you know, five or so years, and will probably, you know, pass away before ever getting to the end of that list. And I guess just like my experience as a renter personally is like, I've always been a renter. I think probably about 3 generations of renters in my family now. So it's been a long time since anyone has owned their home, which kind of means that, like, you know, growing up, renting to an extent did just seem normal. We always rented, all our friends always rented. So that kind of just seemed to be the done thing to an extent. But then, of course, you get older and you start actually realizing all the stuff that comes along with it, and that it shouldn't at least have to be normal. You know, moving every 12 months, never being able to get pets because you may be able to have a pet in this house, but when you move in 12 months' time, you're probably not going to be able to keep it. The family always being stressed coming up to a lease ending in case they decide to chuck the rent up, or you know, tell you. One time we were living somewhere and we had to leave because the landlord decided they wanted to put their son in there. Their son had turned 18, so he was getting the house, you know. Just stuff like that all the time. And then, you know, got older and started renting myself. And I think that's when you actually realize how horrible the system is, once you start directly dealing with the landlords and the real estate, and realizing how much they're always lying to you or trying to force you to do things that they're legally not meant to, but you're 19 and you don't know, and you just need a house, so you're like, okay. And all of that, like, and then, yeah, like with public housing, like so many family members that desperately need it that will never get it. So, you know, then you get homelessness and all of this stuff. And yeah, I hate it. Like, our housing in this country is terrible. You know, even when there is public housing, it's often atrocious. Like, you know, people that are struggling deserve to live in better conditions than usually what's provided. Yeah, so I guess, like, I think my experience with renting is pretty typical of most Australians. Like, one thing I've noticed with a lot of the work that we do with Secure, like organising and stuff, is compared to other work I've done, like, everyone is on board, because everybody that has ever rented has an experience and knows how terrible it is, and how much they're exploited, and how much they're treated like shit, and how they had a leak in their roof once for 12 months and it just wouldn't get fixed, and all of that. It's just like this absolutely universal kind of thing that people go through. And pretty much everybody that isn't currently a landlord knows that it's terrible and thinks that it should change. And yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of people, and probably most people in this call, have had some experience with what you're talking about there. And you know, even myself, I know I've had to move around different share houses with you know, shocking tenant agreements and moldy ceilings and things like that. So it's pervasive, even for people who have, I would say I had pretty good experiences with housing and pretty good access to housing. So yeah, thanks for sharing. Leah, I'd be keen to hear from you, about your experience and how you've sort of accessed and understood housing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I still live with my mum, and so that probably changes my situation. But we were renting for a while earlier this year, and the landlord sort of sold the whole block of approximately 12 units. And I think that brought a few challenges, of course, because it was around the start of the the Sydney lockdown, which I suppose is just ending, but it was around that time. But because of sort of the protections the government was giving to landlords and attempting to not really lock down properly, it was possible for everybody living in our block of units to be evicted, with pretty just straight out evicted. And it was like in the middle of the lockdown that we had to move out. Thankfully, we were in a position of having somewhere to go. But for a lot of the people, there were sort of families with young kids who went to the local school, who had been forced into this like renters market that is even more difficult during a lockdown, because I mean, there's just so many obvious reasons why. So I think that is sort of my personal experience dealing with the housing system. And then in a more role in the welfare action group, I guess, we've been pretty involved in the public housing campaigns and had a lot of conversations with people who live in public housing or are really active in that area. And I think that that's shown how clear it is that like the communities and the people who are living in public housing, especially around Glebe, really don't want to be forced to leave their homes. And actually what they want are repairs for their housing so that they can go on living in this and not to be sort of crammed in the bottom of a 70-30 social housing construct, which is sort of what the proposal is and what the New South Wales government is trying to do across the state. So I guess having those conversations has really shown me that. And one final thing would be that Aman has touched on this a lot and he has very personal experience of it, but like around student housing in the lockdown, there's been a lot of issues around sort of there was a moratorium on eviction for the previous lockdown that was sort of not communicated to anybody living in student housing, which just baffles me a bit. And there were other issues around sort of not being able to get rent reductions, so students are forced to continue going to work in unsafe conditions. And one other thing is around sort of the sale of student housing. So obviously at the moment there's a lot fewer students living in student accommodation, but this is going to change pretty quickly. And the uni is selling off. It sold off a bunch of housing to Igloo, a private housing provider, I guess, but also just like a massive corporation who have increased the rents that they're asking for students living in their accommodation, when there was an agreement with the university that they would not have increased rents initially when the university built this housing. So yeah, I think there's a whole range of student issues and those are just a couple.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think it's really great to hear the different range of experiences that people have had with the housing system, because I think whether you're in a situation where you're still living at home, it's like that still might not be secure, and a lot of people I think generally understand the idea of living at home and living at home a bit later into sort of young adult life as being this kind of thing of comfort and security, and you're sort of not ready to move out and stake your claim in the world yet. But even that can be disrupted when you're renting, especially because these things rely on the kind of insecurities of and volatilities of the housing market. I guess I just wanted to expand briefly on a couple of things you sort of you brought up there, Leah, and other speakers as well. I think one of the main things when we're understanding community and social and public housing, so housing provided for a public good for more vulnerable people who can't access market housing. I think it's really important to understand the response of governments to the ongoing, I guess, natural degradation of the stock that exists in the housing market, and the need to build more. And a lot of the response in New South Wales, at least, has been based around this idea of, the communities plus model. And you mentioned there, Leah, the 70-30 split. So, one of the key ideas and mechanisms behind this is like the idea that, if you have a publicly owned, fully 100% public housing site, in order to raise the money to redevelop it and to repair those units and bring them up to a higher standard, and potentially to build some more, you need to sell that land off to private developers, and 70% of that increased value, when it goes up to apartment buildings instead of low-rise blocks of flats, gets sold off to private developers to make a quick buck, and they pay the state, and the state then has money to build more or repair more housing, and the rest of the 30% then remains as either as social housing, which includes housing that is not directly owned or managed by the government. So it's not public housing, it's managed by a private company, which often after 10 years expires and goes back onto the private market. So you have even less. So you have the situation where the justification for renewing public housing stock that already exists, in this huge deficit of public housing dwellings, the solution is actually to reduce the stock and have less public housing overall, and in the process sell a whole bunch of public land off to private developers. So it is really, really important that tenants and communities are organizing around this in response, because that's what we're coming up against by the people who provide this housing. So when we go back and think about who accesses housing, who uses it, and who provides it, when we're talking about public housing, student housing, social housing, we're talking about the large providers of housing. We're talking about the government, we're talking about corporations like Urbanest or Igloo, and we're talking about community housing organizations, which are private organizations that are run not for profit and regulated by the government. So I'd be interested to hear from each of the speakers, and feel free to jump in as you like. How do we organize? How do we kind of address these issues of the need for more public housing, but also renters' rights and rental security, like as everyone was talking about. Aman, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, I would say you simply fight with your landlord, accommodation management, or university. Like cheap affordable accommodation is a right, not a privilege, especially when you are in the middle of a pandemic. Like as long as you try to negotiate with landlord or accommodation management, they will keep bullying you and will try to make you work according to their terms and condition. So the simple way to address this issue created by landlords is rent strike. I mean, that's my thinking. You send an email to your landlord first, explain your situation, and if they are ready to help you, which is least likely, it is good. Otherwise, you simply stop paying rent. Talk to other people in your house or accommodation and organize a protest. This is exactly what me and other international students did at the Sydney University Village last year, and we won thousands of dollars in rent reduction suspension. And previously, SUV management was not willing to terminate the contract of international students who wanted to leave Australia and wanted to go back to their home country. But because of our strong protest, we managed to do that. So that would be my idea.
I think that's a pretty good idea, for sure, Aman. Thank you. Iswed or Leah, would you like to let us know what you think about organizing?
Yeah, I can jump in. I guess there's a few things, and where it depends on, in a way, on some of the issues that we're talking about. So maybe on like a public housing level, and as people who sort of might not live in public housing, I think that it is really important that there is a strong level, and I've heard this a lot from sort of people involved in like Hands Off Glebe and other organizations, that there's support from the community for that public housing to be there, and that the community shows that what they don't want is like this development, and instead what they want is sort of the life of public housing, and for that to stay. Yeah, so I think that's one important thing, like getting out to sort of the protests, the residents organize, and things like that is one good way, I guess, of addressing these issues. And then in a more student-centric sense, I think Aman is like exactly right. That a rent strike is a great idea. I think that there's really interesting stuff from like the Renters and Housing Union in Victoria, and thinking about how we can organise sort of a more militant renters union, and also connecting these issues to other issues around unemployment. So getting involved in the Unemployed Workers Union is pretty important, because it's often people who are unemployed or sort of students who are precariously employed, and shifts vary, I suppose, who do struggle to pay rent and do struggle with these sort of when rent increases. So yeah, I guess so, like organizing in these different ways are pretty important.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're very fortunate to have someone who's been very active in organizing a strong, staunch grassroots tenants union from essentially from scratch in Queensland. So Iswed, I wonder what your experience has been like, you know, dealing with people with different experiences of housing and different issues.
Yeah, I think we tend to look at it when we discuss like the rental crisis and things like that. We tend to try to avoid kind of reducing things down to questions of like supply and demand. You know, we don't really go, like often people like, the problem is not that we need X more houses built or X more public housing provided and stuff like that. And I think to an extent, you know, building more affordable public housing would be really good. But it's not really about how many need to be built or anything. Like there's a lot of empty houses in existence being sat on by landlords, for instance. So we don't need to build new things. We can use what's there in a lot of ways. So it's not so much about supply and demand when it comes to like how do we solve these issues. We tend to view things instead as being about power. You know, there's a massive power imbalance between landlords or real estates and between renters. Because renters are really isolated, and you know, an individual renter is pretty weak compared to the landlords or the real estates. Like I think Aman's story, that was a really good example of if the tenants get organized and act collectively, all of a sudden they do become very powerful and very capable of achieving change. So we don't tend to necessarily say one specific tactic is the way of doing things. Like rent strikes, for instance, I think certainly have a place and a role, but we probably wouldn't privilege it as any more important than necessarily other things. It's more about, are things being done that are collectively organizing, that are getting people involved, and that is contributing to this kind of collective power being built? You know, are we able to get strong enough to start pushing back against landlords? Because otherwise they're able to really do whatever the hell they want to us. So often it's more about, I think one of the most difficult things is actually convincing people that they can fight. You know, like I said, most people I ever talk to that are renters understand that they're getting screwed over and understand that it's terrible, but they feel that they can't do anything. So they just need to accept it, that they don't want to rock the boat because they don't see any possibility of changing. Because even outside of the tenants movement, in every other sphere, it's been a lot of decades really of kind of being beat down. So I think a lot of the work right now is just trying to build kind of organizations and convince people that you can fight. And if we fight together, we can win. We might lose, but we might win. And if you don't fight at all, you'll definitely lose. So a lot of it for us right now is, yeah, trying to kind of show people that they can fight for their rights with others, and that can be effective. And then these small little fights can contribute to really big changes down the line.
Yeah, thanks, Ispa. I think that's really, really powerful and important, thinking about this concept of power and how it's structured and how it's divided, and what power we have as regular renters or people or students to actually organize and take action, whatever that might look like, whether that's yeah, as you said, rent strikes or other other actions to build power at that grassroots level, I think is really important. People might have, who are with us at the moment might have had experience in Sydney with the Housing Defence Coalition as well, which was active last year, especially around the COVID lockdowns and issues of eviction and actually fighting and organising just purely to defend people who are being unjustly evicted had yielded really excellent results. Being able to stop students being evicted from some of those student housing apartment buildings that I mentioned earlier. People would issue stock standard notices of eviction with no real justification in the middle of a pandemic with no opportunities, often international students who have very little to fall back on. And what they could fall back on was community support and an organized support network and collective of people who could stand in solidarity with them and come out in support and come out in force and push back against this. Not only kind of raising attention to it and to people's particular issues, but actually showing that there is a collective force that occupies these buildings and that can make decisions on their own behalf. I think just quickly on this, it's important to recognize as well that the makeup of the housing system and where that power is distributed economically, as well as sort of like structurally and politically, is really important in terms of what actions we might take. When we're talking about big providers of housing like corporations, community housing providers, or student housing, companies or universities like the University of Sydney, that kind of more direct rent strike, the withholding of rent in order to meet certain demands can be quite effective. But in a very, very diversified and individualized housing market that Australia has right now, those kinds of tactics, often are very, very difficult to pull off and very difficult to be successful because I'm not sure if people are aware of this, but Australia is one of the most individualized housing markets in the world. There's a lot of, it's often the phrase thrown around is mum and dad landlords or mum and dad investors, and it's people who maybe have one house that they live in and one or two other properties that they rent out. And so there's not this kind of collective withdrawal of rent. There's not that kind of collective building of grassroots solidarity and support. It is very much an individual kind of thing if you are going to sort of do something like a rent strike. So that's where we have to think of different kind of approaches. Did any of the speakers have any of you guys have thoughts on that, or want to expand on this idea of how we might organize from below?
I think like what you just raised is something we've spoken about a lot in Secure, like because there's a lot of like really inspiring tenants unions in say the US, but the US is so different because like their situation there is you'll often have a building with like say 50 apartments and it's all owned by the same landlord. Whereas in Australia, you can have a block of apartments and there'll be 50 different real estates and then different landlords through that. So it does bring a lot of questions and make working out how we can do a lot of things more difficult. And we're still having discussions in Secure about, how do we overcome this kind of atomization? And I'm sure like Rahu, for instance, I'm sure would be having very similar conversations because it is a big question. But I think the most important thing, and that's why building ideas like solidarity is so important. And I think trying to have a diversity of tactics that you can use and the understanding that small battles can be really effective, I guess, in the story of the war. So, looking at like, well, this individual house is having this issue and it's not really affecting anybody else because it's just a standalone house. But how can we collectively still act to get this solved? Which can then collectively show people that more fights are capable and go from there.
Yeah, thanks, Iswed. Leah, did you want to jump in as well? So you take yourself off mute before.
Yeah. yeah, sorry. Yeah, James, you were just cutting out a little bit, but I think you're okay.
Oh.
That's okay. Yeah, I was just gonna say, sorry, what could you just remind me what you were asking before? Because
Yeah, well, I think, I know you've been involved in some of those small actions that Iswed was talking about. These kind of small campaigns or small wins that we push for that can snowball into bigger things, or important in building that kind of solidarity. So I wonder if you wanted to speak on that in particular, like those kinds of actions.
Yeah, I mean, I think those kinds of smaller actions are pretty useful in how they sort of build support for larger things. Like there was a pretty good public housing rally outside Parliament House in Sydney earlier this year. And I think the sort of benefit, like the strengths of that were that there were quite a few different community groups and other groups, like there was a big contingent from the Greater Sydney branch of the Unemployed Workers Union, as well as like we brought a contingent, and so did it's quite a few different groups. And I think that was quite useful in showing a few things that are important, that like there are a lot of different people who are affected by housing, maybe not affected by public housing, but know what it's like to be a renter, or know what it's like to live in insecure housing. And that if we show that we can band together and sort of take the road and march around Parliament House, that is important, and then that can contribute to sort of public housing tenants maybe feeling more able to take action, or not feel like they're going to be shunned by the community for thinking they deserve to live there, which is they do deserve to live there, I guess. Yeah, that's my general thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, really, really good thoughts. I mean, I know from my experience, leafleting and chatting to people around, who live in public housing dwellings in Glebe and have lived there for a long, long time. People who have cultivated beautiful gardens in their small, compact front garden that they're allocated in the terrace house.
Sorry,
go on, Leah.
So no, I was just reminded, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think another action that was sort of good was when we disrupted an auction of a public housing property in Glebe. And essentially that by disrupting that auction, so they moved the auction to somewhere in the city, like an auction house sort of thing. I'm not really sure how that works, but there was quite a few people who live in public housing on that same street in Glebe, as well as a bunch of students and stuff. We had a drum. It was quite fun, but also it actually had a small result on some of the changes that the government made to the housing they're going to sell off. So I can't actually remember the details, but it did have an impact on letting residents live there for longer on this certain street. And I think that was important.
I think that's a really excellent example. And I do know the one you're talking about. And to expand on that, I think that there's these macro changes that happen, ideally when you have a successful collective action like that. And then there's those kind of micro benefits that you get from it. On the macro level, that was a really good example of being able to overturn this kind of 70-30 logic of the Communities Plus model. And it wasn't an ideal outcome, but it was a big improvement to get essentially 50% of that site overall to be retained as fully public housing. So as it is, not sort of sold off to or slowly privatized through community housing providers, but staying in actual direct provision from the state. And in doing that allowed residents to be relocated within Glebe during the reconstruction, and actually instead of being shifted out to different areas of Sydney, Greater Sydney, and different suburbs. So again, not an ideal outcome, but quite significant for people who live there. And as I was saying before, there's those kind of small impacts of people having developed their lovely gardens and their attachment to a sense of place, and obviously community networks as well. You live in a place for 20 years or so, and you naturally develop social networks that are very hard to find and pick up somewhere else, if you are moved out to the suburbs for 5 years while they redevelop your house. So really, really important in that sense to I guess build up those networks of connection amongst people who live there, so that they know that they can take action and actually have an impact. And as building that into a sort of broader campaign that can be really impactful and effective at actually challenging these logics that are sort of thrown around, and the assumptions of the models that are used to privatize housing and disrupt tenants and keep renters divided. So I think just to sort of finish this off, I think it'd be a last question before we go into the sort of wrap up. I'd be really interested to hear about your thoughts on the differences between, where kind of grassroots tenant organizing and tenant unions in particular fit into the broader scope of, I guess, trade union organizing and activity. And Leah and Iswed, you're both very active in the trade union movement as well. And Leah through the Unemployed Workers Union, and not Iswed, I'm sure through your union, whatever that might be. I'd be interested to hear how you think that this kind of organizing fits into that broader struggle, and what the differences or limitations might be, and what the possibilities are.
Yeah, I think I'm in the Unemployed Workers Union at the moment. I'm between jobs, just to clarify that one. But I think it's incredibly important, even if you just look at the wider lens of the trade union struggle. You're a lot more able to go on strike or participate in industrial action, which always inherently comes with a risk, if you know that your housing is secure, that you're not liable to, become homeless soon or something like that. So anything that we can do, and I also often say, when it comes to like welfare, we need to fight to raise the welfare rate, because when it's so low, that is directly an attack on the unions, because it makes workers not want to risk their job. And the same goes for housing. So I think it's definitely, these things are definitely connected very closely, and need to be all kind of fought on simultaneously. And I think there's always, limitations to kind of any form, but by building kind of solidarity and understanding the connections between these fights, then I think, all of them will be a lot stronger and a lot better off. And if you look at, we obviously base ourselves as a tenant union on unionism, but more so the more traditional unionism, rather than what the kind of trade union movement has turned into post the Accords. So actually being members run, not having leaders just making decisions, not being a service provision thing, but an actual members run organization that exists to kind of directly fight for what the members decide their needs are at any time. So there is a lot of lessons that you can just draw when kind of establishing a tenants organization from the history of the labor movement and its unions, and how it's successfully fought for things in the past and mistakes that it's made in its history.
Yeah, thanks, Iswed. And Leah, you're also involved in the Unemployed Workers Union. You've been really active around obviously welfare campaigns themselves, but obviously as the welfare convener or collective officer at USAID. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think what Iswed said is really good, and I definitely agree with that. I think that maybe this is a bit separate to your question, but I also think that unions should play an important role in fighting for things like welfare and in the Unemployed Workers Union demand. So I know there was like a car convoy of a couple of UW workers with the Unemployed Workers Union earlier this year, because like COVID lockdowns showed us how, I guess, precarious people's jobs are. And when there was no supplement at the beginning of this lockdown, it was really important for workers in those unions to be mobilizing with people who have been unemployed for a while and organizing around that. I think that in terms of, I guess, like public housing fitting into some of the union movement, I think that it was really good to see some of those connections be made by the Hands Off Glebe group who brought a contingent to May Day as well, and sort of were flyering and getting the word out at May Day about the public housing that they're fighting for, because a lot of people maybe in the union movement would support that, maybe are less aware of it. So I think that a lot of these issues cross over when there's, I mean, the May Day was held at Willow Grove, which is also sort of could be seen as like a public good that was sold off to developers for profit, in the same way that that public housing is being sold off for profit. So I think that there's a lot of important connections between the two.
Yeah, really well said. And I think it also, goes to this idea of defense as well, as much as anything. We've heard the term green bans being thrown around a lot more than usual in the last couple of months. In Sydney we had the green ban on Willow Grove that was unfortunately unsuccessful, but was a kind of unique for the time for this difficult moment for unions in union history, to have that idea being floated again of actual sort of defense and protection of public assets and public good, and that is decided by the community, decided by resident action groups that said, no, this is really important, we're actually not going to give this up, can you help us? And tying those struggles in really closely together, I think is a really excellent kind of image of what we might want as the way forward for the defense of public housing and the defense of community and in general moving forward. Aman, I wonder, before we close, did you have any thoughts on how international students might organize, especially considering that international students are often outside the scope of labor unions or protections in Australia?
I think student activist, international student officer, and then SRC in general should be more active throughout the year for organizing international student. There should be stalls outside every accommodation, University of Sydney accommodation, or like any student accommodation in general. Throughout the year, people talk about the issues which they might be facing. I will quickly talk about some numbers. So I live in the Regiment. It is again one of the University of Sydney accommodation. And there are in total 630 something rooms in this building. And then at the moment, there are no international students because international students usually live in these kind of buildings. So it is half empty. So 300 something rooms are vacant from last 2 years. And this is just the case in this building. And then other university accommodation, for example, Sydney University Village, and then there are other from university as well. They are half empty as well. So in total, there are approximately 1,000 empty rooms, which university could have provided at subsidized price or like for free to people in need, students who are struggling. But then they chose to keep them empty throughout the pandemic, and which is really bizarre. They should not have done this. I think, let's say if SRC or International Student Officer would have kept an eye on this, then this is something which we could have probably fought for, and then could have provided these empty rooms to the people in need.
Yeah, thanks, Aman. And I think you sort of touched there on this really core idea of the need that exists and the contradictions that we have as well. We're in the most, ostensibly the most productive era of society. We're able to produce so much, and yet people still live without housing, and there are many, many, many dwellings unoccupied and kept unoccupied in order to keep prices high for people that do own housing and make a lot of money out of it. I know some corporations like Meriton actually own more unoccupied land than the state does in different areas. 50,000 lots of unoccupied units of land waiting for development, waiting for uplift and rezonings, so that they can make a huge profit out of it, and keeping that land locked away in corporate land banks in order to drive up prices. And I think this idea goes back to something that I think is really important, which is that when looking at housing, it's one of the clearest examples of these contradictions of capitalism. It is something that everyone has experience with. You know, even people who don't have a home are defined by their relation to housing. You know, and everyone has an experience of these kind of contradictions, whether it's, you know, renters' rights and poor quality housing that you have, you know, incredible difficulty rectifying, whether you're evicted for no apparent reason, whether you're experiencing rental stress or housing unaffordability while, you know, there are dozens of empty units in your block or in your street, then it's really clear that these contradictions are very direct. They're getting worse, and we need to organize in order to fight back against them. And I think all of our speakers have spoken really, really eloquently and excellently on this topic and on these contradictions, on this idea of fighting back and organizing. So it's been an absolute pleasure to hear from you all, and thank you very, very much for joining us. I wonder, before we finish, does anyone have any questions or thoughts from, you know, the people who've joined us in the crowd, our virtual crowd? Feel free to pop your hand up or put something in the chat, or just take yourself off mute and ask any questions. Otherwise, we can wrap up in a few minutes. No worries.
I have something.
DeAndre?
Where does cooperative housing kind of sit in this movement for fighting for public housing?
That is an interesting question. Yeah, cooperative housing is, you know, in that spectrum of you know, the housing spectrum that I showed earlier. Cooperative housing kind of sits in the ownership slot of the spectrum, but it's you know, collectively owned. So for people who don't know, you know, people purchase or buy into a segment of a block or a set of units or a lot, and then essentially like own that collectively. Stucco in Darlington is you know, probably the most well-known example for University of Sydney students. There's a lot of different models. The Nightingale model, I think, is another one that's used a lot in Australia. It's, so, you know, it's one of these things that is potentially useful in limited circumstances, but is probably not a widespread or, you know, kind of an effective solution at the mass scale. But it can kind of provide interesting benefits for particular groups like students or like Aboriginal communities. I think, you know, use community land trusts a little bit to achieve solutions to living on country and in community. So it sort of interestingly slots into the system, but, you know, definitely not a widespread solution, I would say. Did anyone else have any thoughts on that, or are there any other questions? If not, that is all good. I might wrap us up for tonight. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. I've just posted in the chat a couple of links, and if anyone's watching this back, we'll put them in the event description or the video description. So check out Secure, check out the Welfare Action Collective, you know, get organized, start talking to people you live with, start talking to people in your building, start talking to other students and comrades and workers, and try and start thinking about housing, I guess, because it's really important. It affects everyone, and it is we're in an absolute crisis, and it's a crisis of capitalism. So get involved in the broader struggle as well, because it's really important that we fight this on all fronts, as our speakers so well put. You know, this fight is tied up with welfare, and it's tied up with all these different struggles. So yeah, really important that we're fighting it on a lot of different fronts from below. So yeah, thank you again. I'll stop the recording